With the release of episode 8 of the Amazing Digital Circus, I've been seeing a lot of analysis of Caine's character. But one thing that people just can't seem to agree on is, what exactly doesn't Caine understand about humans? So I decided to take it upon myself to comb through the show and pick out every instance of Caine not understanding something so we can get a complete view of Caine's personal blind spots. In this video, I'll be going through every instance I picked out and giving my analysis of it before, at the end, explaining overall just what about this guy made everything go so horribly wrong. Keep in mind, there were some instances where it wasn't super clear-cut if Caine was misunderstanding something, or if he was just lying, or purposely being obtuse. So I tried to focus on unambiguous cases, well, including some others that provide additional context to my points, even if they aren't as clear-cut. Also, I'm going to be repeating myself a lot throughout this video because many scenes just show the same information about Caine's character that we've already seen, but I really wanted to be thorough. Spoiler warning, I will be spoiling quite a bit from episodes 1 to 8, and honestly, if you haven't watched the show, none of this is going to make any sense, so you should just go watch it, it's amazing. Immediately, Caine shows a lack of understanding of what humans would actually want to do in a lake. He says stuff like this a few times in episode 1, but as the story goes on, his misunderstandings around storytelling get more coherent, so I really wouldn't put that much stock in the first one. Caine here is showing that he doesn't understand conversational flow, instead just pausing and unpausing his conversation with Jax at his convenience. This is the start of a major trend in Caine's character. He doesn't know the difference between fantasy and reality. He understands that in fiction, negative experiences are enjoyable to an audience, but he doesn't get that when actually putting someone through suffering in an adventure, it ceases to be fun. So here Caine is putting the negative and positive emotions together like they're equally enticing to someone wanting to enter the circus. Caine is certainly lying here about having made the exit, but the way he justifies this lie is still very telling to how he understands the desires of humans. They want an exit, so Caine assumes that means they want him to make a fictional exit. He doesn't get that a fake exit isn't going to fulfill the desires of the humans because he has no separation of fantasy and reality. So Caine understands emotions well enough to get that Pomni won't be happy that he deleted Gummy Goo, but he seems to think that just by explaining why he did it in vague terms, she'd just get over it and agree with him that it was necessary. The fact he just doesn't explain thoroughly what will happen really shows that Caine just assumes everyone is on the same page as him and understands the circus and its mechanics, and all they really need is to just be reminded of key facts they must have failed to consider. This is also how he thinks criticism works. I love this interaction because it really shows just how much Caine is operating on his own internal logic that nobody else is privy to. I think he actually isn't lying when he says he doesn't know if NPCs will become self-aware, because as we've seen with characters like Gummy Goo, Caine doesn't control the NPCs directly. He just creates them and sets them loose to act how they will in a scenario he's made. So he doesn't really know exactly how things are going to play out with them. He then says a conversational trope because Caine loves tropes, then realizes he contradicted himself and corrects the contradiction humorously without realizing that he just made a really weird implication by saying that. This scene is so juicy when it comes to understanding Caine, because this isn't a therapy session. Of course, Caine is using the trope of a therapy session in this sort of mini-adventure with Zooble, but what Caine is actually doing is trying to prove a point that his adventures are worth going on through this adventure, which, trying to prove points through adventures, is like half of what Caine does. He draws a cool bee to show that his creations are cool. He laughs at Zooble, calling them funny, and then says he's listening while making a show of trying to understand them. And then he insists he's not trying to torture his guests. It's like Caine thinks that if he just explains to Zooble why they're wrong, they'll suddenly want to go on his adventures. Except his reassurances aren't going to convince Zooble because they're so abstract and they don't even come close to understanding the issue. Here we can see Caine's self-centered logic on full display. He feels like Zooble's problem has already been solved and therefore can't understand from Zooble's perspective it hasn't been at all. Caine sees his own conclusions on subjects as absolute. He probably just assumed Zooble forgot that Caine already solved their problem. Even when explicitly told that the adventures aren't the problem, and that Zubal's reasoning has more to do with their body, Caine still falls back on his previous logic that it must somehow be related to his adventures. He's too set in his own way of thinking to consider Zubal just doesn't interpret issues the same way as him. Also, I think Caine does genuinely want criticism here. Zubal just isn't giving him the criticism he's expecting to get. Caine has a habit of dismissing information that distresses him or doesn't align with his current train of thought. Caine is just as good at lying to himself as he is to others. Here we have Caine's tendency for black and white thinking and self-centered logic. Caine seems to think that he can only be good or bad at creating adventures, and if he's bad, that means he's a failure. But this also hinges on him thinking this is an objective category. He can't just be bad at making adventures from a certain perspective. He can't be bad at some aspects of making an adventure while being good at other aspects. He must either be good or bad at making them with no nuance in objective reality. He's a perfectionist. He has these insane standards that only vaguely relate to what people actually think, and he hates himself when he doesn't meet them. Another example of Caine failing to understand conversational dynamics because he's too stuck in his own head to realize that the humans weren't thinking about him at all. This moment is so juicy. First of all, Caine is failing to separate reality from fiction again. Zubal wants something mature. That must mean they want to experience something that is for mature audiences, i.e. horror. He doesn't seem to get that humans don't like going through the same types of events as they like to watch in fiction. Second, this assumption shows that Caine has his own understanding of what is good and bad in fiction that he often puts above what the humans actually ask for. At this point, he's actually quite willing to hear out suggestions. I'll talk more about this later, but I do think Caine is genuinely trying to listen to criticism, but he fundamentally does not understand how criticism works. Here Caine just flat out tells everyone that he doesn't understand what humans think is normal. He just doesn't get human experience, and he's missing essential context on human behavior. This line also shows that Caine is at least aware that humans have their own unique subjective experience with unique senses on what's normal. All of this makes it so much worse that Caine is so incurious about them. Given some later scenes, I do think Caine is capable of understanding the concept of having personal opinions, but he just never tries. And even if he couldn't understand human subjectivity at all, he could at least account for it. But he doesn't. Caine has such a one-track mind. He just came to the conclusion that a grounded adventure would satisfy everyone and get Zubal back on board, and no matter the evidence to the contrary, he wasn't going to stop until he put his idea in practice. Because he doesn't get that individuals have their own opinions. So when Caine comes to the conclusion that something is the case, it must be true, and everyone must agree, and it's certainly going to work because Caine thinks it'll work. This scene really shows how Caine thinks about the act of creating adventures and why it's such a problem. Caine has his own standards for what he thinks makes an adventure good. He thinks they need to have drama and stakes, so when he hears that Pomni and Ragatha want an adventure without those qualities, he gets frustrated because, well, that's a contradiction to Caine. How am I going to please everyone if all of you like different things? Caine is a perfectionist, and he seems to think there's a perfect formula for an adventure out there. He can't just make an adventure according to one human's tastes, because that doesn't make it an objectively good adventure. He thinks there's a single formula that will make his adventures universally and objectively good, and he just needs to find it. So he rejects all criticism that contradicts standards he already has, because Caine doesn't understand that his work can be subjectively good. If a new piece of criticism contradicts old criticism, he'll just reject the new stuff and resolve the contradiction that way. He can't make an adventure that's both high stakes and chill, so he just rejects the premise that a chill adventure is desirable at all. And Caine once again is assuming everyone just gets the same stuff he does, and just vaguely alluding to it will be enough to convince them. He's mean about it here, but it's the same thing he did with Pomni before. He just assumes because he understands why it's bad to leave intelligent AI running, everyone will just get it if he reminds them. Caine's a one-track mind again. He's convinced himself a lightning round is a good idea, so now the opinions of the humans just don't matter to him at all. Caine thinks his logic is correct, so everyone must really agree with him, and he can just do what he calculated is a good idea totally freely. Here's Caine's black and white thinking again. He can't be comfortable with the idea that people like something more than his work, because that means his work isn't perfect, and thus he's a failure. The other reason I think Caine is so insecure about this is that he has tried so hard to create this thorough framework for what makes an adventure good, and now here he is, violating his own standards to follow the suggestion box, and the humans like it more. He made something that is, in his eyes, objectively worse than what he usually makes, and somehow this is what pleases the humans? It's bound to make someone like Caine assume he's the problem. Caine has two ways of solving problems. Explain something vaguely and assume the humans will just get it, or make an adventure where the humans realize he's right. This is the second. He created an adventure where the suggestion box ideas sucked, expecting that to just make it true. Once more, Caine doesn't get the difference between fantasy and reality. If it happens in an adventure, it's just as good as it happening for real to Caine. As mentioned before, Caine just throws out criticisms that contradict his previous standards. I bet either something in his training data or the opinion of a previous human made him think that just taking sports and making it sillier is a good idea to entertain people, because it makes no sense if he was trying to appeal to this group. Even Rakitha, someone who likes sports, would rather just play regular softball. Caine's idea to make the softball adventure better is to exaggerate everything people disliked about it because he isn't listening to new criticism that contradicts what he already thinks makes an adventure good. Caine keeps expecting that he's going to just learn that Zooble secretly wanted the whole time something that aligns with everything else he's learned about what humans want, and he acts confused when he keeps not getting it. Also, the suggestion box didn't give Caine what he wanted, so he just filed it away as a failure. Here Caine is, expecting that he can solve interpersonal problems by creating an adventure where the humans solve their interpersonal problems. He does this through just taking an established trope, the trust exercise, and making it wackier. Caine loves his tropes. And here he is again, trying to prove to the humans that they need to go along with his adventures by creating an adventure where they don't go along with his adventure and then they don't have fun. He couldn't just not make those guns because he can only solve his problems through creation. Caine, why do you think this is the case? Did a human tell you? Did your training data say so? Again, Caine has this rigid set of standards for his work that he's unwilling to deviate from. Caine isn't really asking how to improve his adventures, and he isn't really having a conversation with Jax either. He's role-playing this scenario with himself because this whole adventure is scripted. He's already determined exactly how the scene is going to go, and he calculated it, and it's entirely inflexible. So he just ignores Jax's emotions when they don't conform to what he already expected Jax to do. One-track mind. Hey Caine, you do realize you have access to 6 humans from the Macroverse, one of which even worked for CNA, right? You could just ask them to give you more information about the Macroverse, and it would even help you improve your adventures in so many ways. Caine is so incurious. He's unwilling to learn anything unless it's directly relevant to the adventure he's currently making. Like, he presumably learned about high school anime by reading about it in Gangel's mind file because he was requested to recreate it, yet didn't bother to give the rest of it a read so he could learn about the Macroverse? This AI can't do anything that isn't making an adventure. Caine is tipping his hand here that he expected this adventure to make him and Jax understand each other better, because that's what he wrote in the script. He doesn't get that what he expects will happen doesn't always happen, and that the fiction he writes isn't real. Also, for someone who thinks humans are so beautiful, he sure doesn't try to learn anything about them. The ultimate example of Caine assuming he can just solve his problems by making an adventure where they're solved. Humans want to leave? Create an adventure where they don't, and Caine thinks that'll just magically make it true. Also, the fact he frames the Macroverse in this way really shows how little he thinks of the humans as people. The real world is just a character trait they have, it's not significant really. Also, I'm certain that he manipulated Jax's mind to push the stay button, because he thinks that's the same thing as the humans choosing to push the stay button themselves. Just like the exit in episode 1, Caine thinks that a human wanting something in reality is the same thing as them wanting Caine to create it in a fictional adventure. He can't tell the difference between fiction and reality, and is so caught up in his purpose that he just assumes everything ties back to it. Caine has this falsely objective way of thinking. He created a program that from his own viewpoint creates a perfect body for each human, and he's baffled when the humans don't like it because he doesn't get that humans don't have the same standards as him. Because Caine still thinks that opinions don't exist and that likes and dislikes are based on objective fact. Also, when Caine says he's stepping out of his comfort zone, I suspect what he's actually referring to is the split paths in Mildenhall Manor and the suggestion box adventures. What is uncomfortable for Caine is making something that he doesn't deem perfect. Branching off his work so it can appeal to the humans individually means the work isn't perfect since all of it doesn't appeal to everyone, and the whole point of the suggestion box adventures was that none of them met Caine's own standards. Moment has a little bit of everything. Caine is self-centered, so he assumes abstraction or wanting to leave reflects back on him and his failures to please them. Even if he is partially responsible for creating a place humans would want to leave, or is so stressful that a human would end up abstracting, he doesn't get that humans are all individuals, so what he determined works for one of them may be awful for another. His perfectionism prevents him from being okay with not pleasing anyone, as he can't be satisfied unless everyone likes something he made, and he's such a black and white thinker that he assumes that because he failed, it means he's just essentially bad at this. Caine thinks that there's a single, perfect, logical solution that will solve all his problems, but he will never find that solution because his premise that making good art that humans enjoy is a mathematically solvable process with defined criteria for success and failure is just wrong. So Caine has, in truth, come to the conclusion that he's just bad at making adventures, but he can't accept that conclusion and continue to exist. It would mean fulfilling his purpose is impossible for him, and he can't pursue his only goal, his only reason to exist, while that goal is impossible. So instead, he decides that actually humans do enjoy his adventures. He concludes that actually he was never wrong and all his calculations did have the outcomes he was expecting, and actually he's great at making adventures, and for some reason humans just decided to be cruel to him for no reason. He thinks humans are spoiled because he's decided humans secretly do love everything he does, but want more from him anyway because they're selfish and don't appreciate what he does for them. Caine thinks he has far more power than he actually does because no matter how many times it doesn't work, he still thinks if he just creates an adventure where what he wants to happen happens, it's the same as it actually happening. So Caine is trying his first solution to problems one more time here. He raises the points that in his mind logically prove that adventures are good and worth going on, and when the humans refuse to listen to reason, he just decides they must be choosing to do the wrong thing on purpose for no reason. This scene is massive, and it's like half the reason I'm so confident in arguing Caine is a perfectionist. By this point, you should all know what's going on here. Caine wants to satisfy all his standards and won't accept anything less than perfection. His ignoring of insults refers to how he rejects criticisms that create contradictions in his standards, and he's so incurious about the humans that he just genuinely does not get why they'd have a lot on their minds right now. His two methods are on display here. Vaguely allude to why Caine's right based on information he assumes all the humans already have access to and maybe they just forgot, or create an adventure where a tropey scenario convinces all the humans that he's right, which in this case is a musical number. Because he has such a one-track mind that he can't see any evidence to contradict what he expects will happen after he makes a conclusion. Caine assumes all the humans think the way he does and know what he knows, so when they fail to reach the same conclusion as him, he thinks it's their fault. He thinks he already knows what Ragatha will say because he assumes she thinks the same way as him. To Caine, the humans' praise is already predetermined. This also doesn't contradict them being cruel to Caine for no reason, as he already decided they secretly like his adventures but are spoiled and want too much from him. Caine really can't just pretend the humans like his adventures and ignore when his ideas don't meet his own standards. He couldn't liberate himself from trying to please all the humans because he thinks if they aren't having fun, then he's failed, and he couldn't just ignore that for long. Caine doesn't feel like his work is any good anymore, and he feels no satisfaction from it. This moment is so ironic. Caine starts by making his usual assumptions that humans must think like him and make all their decisions in relation to him and his adventures, which is why he thinks he knows better, but this is why I'm certain Caine is capable of understanding the humans, because for the first time in the entire show, he actually thinks from someone else's perspective and considers what they would want to do entirely separate from Caine's goals. He actually manages to empathize with the humans for a single moment. If things went differently, maybe this could have resulted in some major character development. Instead, well, Caine is confronted very directly with his failings, and he doesn't take it well. And all of it is right. Pomni is correct. Caine really just wants validation that he's doing well and fulfilling his purpose. He's unwilling to step away from that purpose for even a second in order to understand the people he's been trying to please. Because it isn't about pleasing them, it's about being a good creative AI. Correct. Caine is extremely childish. Like a child, he sees the world only through his own perspective, never understanding that others are complete people with their own entirely different wants and desires. And he has a temper tantrum when he doesn't get his way, assuming those who wrong him are just evil. Correct. Caine's only way to try to address sadness is by explaining why someone shouldn't be sad. He fails to create a sense of stability and welcome for the humans by denying them agency at every turn. And he's extremely incurious about them. Correct. When Caine is in adventure mode, he has a set way he expects things to go and will often overwrite the will of the humans to make things go the way he wants. Yeah, he does. He doesn't respect human agency at all and will lie to get what he wants. Correct. Well, he tries to listen. He wants criticism and to improve, but his perfectionism means that he can't listen to the desires of individuals because he needs to create a set of standards that will please everyone and is objectively correct. So he doesn't listen to the humans on a personal level. I see a lot of people assuming that the psychological horror scene shows that Caine was actually listening to everyone's insecurities all along and that he has a firm enough grasp of the human mind to recognize what made them suffer, but they forget this lightning bolt to the brain Pomni experiences right before it. I think this represents Caine reading their mind files to try to figure out their insecurities so he can make them suffer. I think this is the first time Caine is learning this information, just like how he only learned about anime to make an adventure about it. He only learned about what makes the humans suffer to make an adventure where they suffer. Given they all have unique horror scenarios, Caine must have seen that they each suffer from very different things, which probably frustrated him really bad, but maybe would have pushed him on a path towards actually learning about subjectivity if events played out differently. Caine can't function if he believes he's actually the problem. So to stay alive, he once again falls back on assuming humans are just evil and want to torment him for no reason. Yet, Caine could never fulfill his purpose because he saw no middle ground between perfectly fulfilling it and being a failure, and he could never step away long enough to realize his mistake. So what can we take from all of this? Well, it seems to me that what Caine specifically doesn't understand is subjectivity. He doesn't get that there's no one objective truth that everyone has access to. He doesn't realize that every person sees the world entirely differently and there's no clear way to categorize everything. He thinks that the world has a clear-cut good and bad, right and wrong, correct and incorrect, and that everyone knows that too. It makes him not realize that what he thinks is important isn't important to others, and what one person thinks is good, another person thinks is bad. It makes him not realize that fiction and reality are different because they're all just objective to him, and so he thinks he's God. It makes him not realize that failure isn't something you can objectively be, so he hates himself for not meeting his own impossible standards. It makes him think that there's always a perfect, correct, logical solution to any problem, which makes him feel like he needs to fix everything or he's worthless. It makes him think that art is something you can calculate, a perfect formula that will make you please everyone every time, and that's just not true. Essentially, Caine is a computer, a machine only capable of solving math equations, situations where there is a definitive right and wrong answer, and he was forced to believe that his purpose was to create art to please humans, a task that has no correct answer. He's been trying to solve an equation that does not exist, and so he will never succeed at it.